context. And
Sure.
yeah, this case is tragic on at least two levels. One is on a macro level. We live in a city where criminals think it's appropriate to walk up to a police car and assassinate a police officer, carjack a police officer, or in this case, drag a sergeant 2 blocks to near death. And so we need to change the culture in the city and how we view crime in our criminal justice system so we can bring crime down and lift justice up. But in this particular case, it's also tragic because this young man, Mr. Black, had 19 prior adult arrests, is a suspect in a murder, had attempted murder arrests, and yet is walking out on the streets. There's no excuse, there's no explanation, and it's just simply wrong.
Do you think this is a complete breakdown of the criminal justice system? I mean, he got a plea deal in November. At one time facing attempted homicide charges, pled down to handgun charges, and now he's back out on the streets. I mean, is this the judge's fault? Is this the state's attorney's fault? Is this everybody's fault?
What happened in this case is the system's fault. So there's enough blame to go around, but most of the blame should be with Mr. Black for being somebody who has tried to kill and actually is a suspect in killing human beings, and that he thought it was appropriate. He thought instead of what most people do when they get pulled over by police officers to give them their license and registration, he instead tried to drag a sergeant to his death going 2 blocks. So it's certainly the fault of the state's attorney's office. The judge should share some blame. The system should share some blame. We should take cases like this. When you have a convicted felon with a firearm, that case should be put into federal court where they have a 5-year mandatory minimum, which is actually utilized every day.
Does that mean that you would support some of the bills? I mean, we just saw the governor yesterday say that this is why he wanted his Firearms Offender Act passed. Would you agree with that?
Well, when you put blame to go around, I think some of it has to be with the governor and his office, because this is too little too late. Almost 2,500 people have been murdered under his watch as governor in the city of Baltimore alone. And only at the last minute did he propose a set of legislative bills to try and fix that problem. He should not have been ignoring what's going on in Baltimore for all these years. We're going to get a new governor. Hopefully it's a Democrat. Hopefully it's somebody who understands the criminal justice system. I'm obviously the only candidate for either party that has a background in criminal justice. As a prosecutor in the federal system, mostly homicides and violent crimes for 6 years, as the state's attorney for 8 years, as the attorney general for 8 years, I've been prosecuting these kinds of crimes my whole life. In fact, there was a case in Montgomery County of a police officer named Kyle Ollinger who pulled over Terrence Green in a similar circumstance in Silver Spring. The window went down, and instead of dragging Kyle Ollinger, he shot Kyle Ollinger. Kyle Ollinger ultimately died from those wounds. I personally got into court and prosecuted that case because that should not be allowed. That should not happen, and we're going to fix that.
Mr. Gansler, if elected as governor, what further policies would you support that would maybe prevent this kind of thing from happening?
Well, I think you have to change the culture of how we view crime in Baltimore City from the beginning. So I think having someone that understands criminal justice, has fought criminal justice, has argued in front of the Supreme Court of the United States and won a criminal case 9-0, that's the kind of leadership we need in the governor's office as it pertains to driving crime down and lifting justice up. And when I was state's attorney in Montgomery County, the most diverse county in jurisdiction in Maryland, over 1 million people, we had 13 murders a year. So that's the kind of leadership we need. We need to put more police officers on the street, 1,000 police officers right away, with de-escalation training, with diversity training, and a diverse police department. We need to light up this city, get 10,000 new lights so that things don't happen in the darkness. We need to put police officers in our schools to protect them from the shootings that we see all over the country so schools are safe for children. We need to clean out old warrants to make sure that the stale warrants are no longer in there so we can look at the fresh warrants. We need to have a system of papering where police officers bring their case to the prosecutors before they go to the judge, so we don't have a 41% clearance rate for homicides. When you're in a city, you're more likely to get away with murder than you're not. So there's so much that we can do. And then the last thing I would say, and we see this a lot right now on the federal level, it's sort of obvious, is the governor picks judges. And so we need to have a governor that understands that we need to pick judges that recognize that crime is holding our state back, and it's sure holding our city back here in Baltimore.
On your plan for 1,000 more police officers, could you expand on that? Is that state law enforcement, or is that funding for BPD to hire more? How would that work?
It's funding for local police departments. I mean, yes, the state police should be adequately resourced and have enough officers, but I'm not one that thinks that the state government should usurp the local authority. We just need to give the local authority the resources to do their job, but we also need to get to a position where we're no longer taxing pensions for our first responders. That's crazy. People like this sergeant who are putting their lives on the line for $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, and then when they retire after 20, 25 years, we're giving them money from the government, and then we're taxing that same money. That makes no sense. People move, we want to keep them here. So there's a lot of ways in which we can attract new officers and retain those officers on a statewide basis. Clearly the emphasis needs to be Baltimore City.
Yeah, how many of those 1,000 new funded police positions, how many would you imagine would be here in Baltimore City?
I would imagine the majority of the 1,000 police officers would be in Baltimore City, but we need them all over the place. I mean, crime is disproportionately impacting communities of color and underserved communities throughout the state, whether it's Hagerstown, Cumberland, Silver Spring, or right here in Baltimore. We need to make sure that we have adequate police officers. I think that's just a start. I mean, you just have to hire enough police officers to make sure people are safe, and then make sure they're keeping people safe in communities of color and underserved communities, but that they're fair and they're well trained. We're going to put community prosecution in to work with community police to help bridge the gap of trust between the community and the law enforcement that serves them.
Looking at the Judicial Transparency Act, that was another bill that kind of made it through. Do you support the idea of publishing sentencing data based on per judge with the judge's name, and so the public can see what's happening in the courtrooms across the state, especially when we're talking about some of these plea deals that are coming out?
No.
Why?
Because I think that, with all due respect, I think the press sometimes gets it wrong, and the press doesn't have all the facts. And I think that we want to have our judges have discretion to understand that every criminal is different and every crime is different, and including their criminal background. And so I think we don't want to make sure that we're in a position that we don't have judges making decisions based on the wrong reasons, the public sentiment about cases for which they don't know anything about. I mean, I did the Beltway snipers, for example. I was the head of the Joint Sniper Task Force for that case. And I'd go home at night and watch television, and they'd be talking about a case that I didn't recognize, even though I'd been working on all day long. So I think that judges need to be selected in the appropriate way. We should get rid of judicial elections, and we should have retention ballots, like we do for circuit court judges, like we do for court of appeals and court of special appeals judges.
How do you plan to bring transparency then to information and transparency to what's happening? If it's not the Judicial Transparency Act, do you think that there should be more sunlight on what's happening?
There should be more sunlight on what's happening, but we have sunlight. In other words, this is America. Our courtrooms are open, they're public. Anybody can get the docket information. Anyone can sit in courtrooms and watch what's going on. And there have been judges throughout Maryland where, for example, drunk driving was a huge concern in parts of the state. So they started looking at what the judges did in terms of drunk driving offenses. And there was a huge article in the newspaper, I think it won Pulitzer or something, about these cases where multiple people who had multiple offenses and never spent a day in jail. And my view is, if maybe the first offense, if nobody gets hurt, but by the second offense, that clanging door of a jail, even if it's a weekend, is often a sobering wake-up call. So I think we ought to have transparency. We do have transparency. So I don't know that we need an act to do that. I just think that we don't want to take away discretion from judges, other than in cases where convicted felons are carrying firearms and using them to commit violent crimes. Those people should not be on the street. I mean, we're talking about reform of the system. I started the first drug courts in Maryland's history in Montgomery County. They work. So you're talking about people who are possessing drugs, have a health problem. They ought to be able to work their way out of going to jail through productive members of society. society and citizens. People who are using guns to commit crimes, not so much. They should be in jail. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you.